good afternoon or good morning for those who are following from the US. So it's a great pleasure to start this second session of the open research seminar of the RENEW18 project. So the RENEW18 project, just as a reminder for those who don't know it already, is a research endeavor in the EOS Excellence Program, co-founded by FWO and FNRS in Belgium, led by three PIs, Karine de Boer, Arnaud Pelletier, and Stéphane Duchesne, and with quite a big meeting of team of postdoc and doctoral researchers, among whom myself. And the Open Research Seminar is an occasion, the name says, a research seminar open to everybody, where we discuss recent research and publications in the field of early modern philosophy and science. And today we have the great pleasure to have Katherine Brading and Marius Stan with us, who are the authors of the now published book, Philosophical Mechanics in the Age of Reason, with Oxford University Press. And we agreed to read the chapter 1, the introduction, then chapter 3, Beyond Newton and Leibniz, Bodies in Collision. But before getting into the discussion and the Q&A, Katherine and Marius, you have the floor for a few minutes to present your work and, well, say whatever you want about your research. And thank you very much again for joining us and for the opportunity to discuss your work with us.
Thank you. So thank you very much for doing this. We obviously have, very much overlapping interests and common concerns. So it's really great to have this opportunity to talk about what we've been doing with you and to get your input and to see where our common concerns are. So Marius and I thought we would open things up by each of us just saying a few words about how we came to this project, and then some of the themes that particularly interest each of us about the work that we did together. And that might just do some scene setting, and then we can talk about whatever you would like to talk about, because we came to the project from different directions. So I came to it, I was working on Newton and things in the 17th century, and I got really interested in unsolved problems in the wake of Newton's Principia, so early 18th century things. So I had that on the one hand, and then on the other hand, my original background is in philosophy of physics, and I have this long-standing interest in how physics comes to be about whatever it's about and how it constitutes its own object. So I'd been really interested in that with respect to Newton, with respect to what are these bodies that are supposed to be the subject matter of his laws. So putting those two things together, it became clear to me anyway that this question of what are bodies, and how do we find out what they are, how do they act on one another, these kinds of general questions about body and the nature of body was an unsolved problem at the beginning of the 18th century, and I wanted to kind of track it through and see if I could make my way all the way back to the sort of late 19th, early 20th century era of physics that I knew a lot more about. I'm really interested in Hilbert and his axiomatic method and things like that. So I was playing around with this, looking for secondary literature, not finding very much. So philosophers of physics have worked a lot on space and time and gravity in the 18th century, and very much less on classical mechanics and terrestrial physics and that kind of thing, and less on kind of the methods of doing that kind of work, with an important exception being Stephan's work. So that was, been an important source, his work on Strauss-Sundy and Muschenbroek and things. It was really great to find someone else who was interested in these figures. So that was kind of the background coming into the project, and I had thought we'd sort of trace these kinds of issues through the 18th century and it would be fairly straightforward. That turned out not to be the case, and through the course of writing the book, we kind of had to sort of reframe things in our sort of analytic framework several times. And in the end, as we worked our way through what the people themselves were doing, we settled on this category that we bring to what we're reading of philosophical mechanics. So one thing that became really interesting to me was the way in which we have, on the one hand, physics as a branch of philosophy, primarily qualitative. Still at the time, that was the conception of physics as being interested in the nature and properties of bodies and the search for causes. And on the other hand, rational mechanics as a branch of mathematics, and for the most part still practiced by different people from the people who are doing natural philosophy. And the way their methods were different, but they had this common subject matter of bodies. And just watching the way that these two disciplines are kind of wrestling with one another and trying to work together or fighting each other in different ways in order to articulate a notion of body that's adequate both for physics and for rational mechanics. So what else was important? So in the early part of the century, collision theory is really important. This is one of the places where the rules of collision, which belonged sort of really to mechanics rather than to philosophy, come into playing this dual role of being part of Descartes' physics, for example, but also part of mechanics. By the mid-century, the people working in mechanics are finding that in order to have some theory of extended bodies, we're going to need to do a lot more than have just rules of collision. So mechanics becomes more and more important. And that's really the second half of the book, where we've worked through the contributions of mechanics and all the complexities that are involved in trying to theorize about extended bodies and how difficult that gets. So I'm just going to kind of finish up by one of the things that I really enjoyed in the second half of our book is the work on D'Alembert, and watching the way in which these two different methods, kind of more axiomatic approach that comes out of mechanics and mathematics, with the methods that are coming out of philosophy, come together. And how we can sort of look at the work after that from two lenses, either from the philosophical side or from the rational mechanics axiomatic side. So we have this chapter on principle versus constructive approaches to thinking about what the nature of the objects is that our theory is supposed to be about. By the end of the book, we conclude that this project of philosophical mechanics, of trying to bring natural philosophy and mechanics together to give an account of bodies, doesn't succeed, but it doesn't succeed for all sorts of interesting philosophical reasons that have really long-term implications for philosophy and for physics. So maybe I'll hand over now to Marius, because he was coming at things from a slightly different direction.
Slightly, yeah. Thank you. I also would like to thank all of you for organizing this session today. My wife asked me last night, so where is it? And I told her, and she said, oh, so I guess you're big in Belgium. So, because it's the second time I presented to your group, which is true, actually. It seems that, I'm pleased that Romanian and Belgian scholars are taking up the result of our research a lot more than, people in North America here. So I guess I came at this problematic from two directions. The first one, I see that Rob is attending today, so he'll be able to relate. He was my dissertation advisor. And Rob suggested that maybe I should look into Kant's theory of motion, what he means by relative motion, by absolute motion, what he does with Newton's absolute space. Back when I started, there was this, that this territory was dominated by the work of Friedman, Michael Friedman, that, in essence, it says that Kant had read Newton and was trying to show that, the real metaphysical foundations for Newton's science, I finally give them 100 years after the fact. So I started with Kant's early papers on natural philosophy. There's this little known piece on, Kant's theory of relative motion. So I read that paper. I just kept scratching my head. I couldn't make any damn sense of it because Kant was looking at, one thing bumping into another, two balls colliding. It's collision theory. So you read that, you're like, where are the planets? Where's gravity? I was told that, Kant was into Newton and, I'm waiting to see action at a distance and, planets and stars. I'm not sure if Rob remembers this, but he and I once spent 8 hours in his office trying to make sense of Kant's early theory of relative motion. Like, what's going on here? Why is there collision in this paper? And if you read Kant's later work, the supposed, great treatise where he finally gives the true foundations of Newtonian science, when he gets to mechanics and the laws of motion, again, it's one ball bumping into another. Collision theory. That's all you get in that mechanics. So I read that book too. I'm supposed to write a chapter about it in my dissertation. And it's more collision. And in grad school or in college, if you're lucky, they teach you that the problem of collision had been solved in 1668 by Huygens and Wallis and what's the third one?
Ren.
Christopher Wren. Yes, right. So 120 years after that problem was supposedly solved, here comes this guy, this Germanic guy, still talking about collisions and stuff. So again, because I had the dissertation to write, I started reading around a little bit, and I thought, why don't I look at these other Germanics in the 18th century to see what they were trying to do? And you see collisions all over the place. In Christian Wolff and his many disciples, he was big. Christian Wolff was big in Germany, unsurprisingly. And he had many, little Wolffians trying to be like him. And they all, when it comes to natural philosophy, impact is, the centerpiece of their theories. And as I was reading these guys, it seemed to me, based on what Christian Wolff at least was trying to say, their point was to use some kind of a metaphysics of body or material object and some, metaphysically derived principle or laws of motion, so that from this philosophical foundation, you could explain or even deductively infer the rules of collision, the two equations that tell you the exit velocities for two bodies once they bump into each other. And when I read that, the scales fell off my eyes, because I thought, oh, so that's also what this guy Kant is trying to do. You finally make sense of why he looks at impact, why he has those laws, why there's no, F equals ma in his book, why there's no gravity and stuff. So when I realized that, campus-based philosophers talked about collisions for at least 100 years after the problem was supposedly solved, I thought that, there's a lot to discover there. And then we started looking at, France and England. And there too, you see, maybe not for as long as it happened in Germany, but easily for 8-9 decades, sustained philosophical discussions of, what's really going on when, as Descartes says, when a body meets a body, when two objects, interact by contact. So that's the origin of the first half of the book. That you can see from the table of contents, and chapter 3 is again the centerpiece for this sustained century of philosophical attempts to give a sound basis to collision theory. For the second half, again, because I worked with Rob in grad school and we had similar backgrounds and sensibilities, I also I've always liked the history of physics. I guess Ovidiu and Mihna might attest. It's a big thing in Romania when you grow up as a philosopher. So I read things in the history of physics in the in the history of the physics that happened after Newton. So as I'm sure Marco and all of you have seen, it's not all F equals ma. There's all kinds of, new concepts and new principles that people devise and try to get quantitative theory out of. There's action principles, variational principles. There's, notions of virtual work and virtual displacements and stuff that, you can't really get out of the Principia. So as I was reading these things, 18th and early 19th century, developments in mechanics, I kept wondering, it's the old Mark Wilson question, like, what is classical mechanics really? What makes all of this one theory? Is it one theory, or is it just a patchwork of, little local stories that, you make up to, help you run the mathematics through this or that particular type of mechanical process? So for a while I thought, oh, maybe I guess it must count as one theory because it's about a single type of, object, the concept of body that mechanics presupposes. So I ran with that idea for a while. I was trying to, satisfy myself that mechanics is one theory because it's about a single type of object. But, that's not really true. You learn after a while, and you can see that in the second half of the book. There's at least 3 different types of objects that, people work with in mechanics at this point. There's the mass point, the rigid body, and the deformable continuous matter. And you can't reduce any of these things to the other. They're mutually irreducible. So there's 3 different ontologies, if you wish. So I realized, well, so I guess mechanics is not one theory because it rests on a single type of object. Maybe it's one theory because it just has a single set of laws. There's one small set of principles and they apply to all the mechanical phenomena. But then that's not really true either, you discover as you keep reading, because, F equals ma is too weak to help you deal with, systems with constraints, for instance. Masses tied to each other by, strings, or forced to slide on curved surfaces, stuff like that. You can't use F equals ma in those situations because we explain in the book why it doesn't work. If you try to make sense of, water or, flesh, wood, things below the moon, things around us on Earth, you have to think of them as continuous matter. And again, F equals ma is too weak for that. You need stronger dynamical laws to make sense of their motion. So the upshot being, again, as I kept reading, I realized, well, you can't say mechanics is just one theory because it has like one overarching law either. There's more than one law, and you can't reduce them to each other. You can't derive the others from just the principle of least action, or F equals ma. So that's also the sort of like path of inquiry that we pursue in the second half of the book. These projects of unifying philosophical mechanics, of showing it to be a single project, as it were. And we start asking, in virtue of what did they think it counted as one picture, as it were? And we introduce these 2 categories of constructive approaches to philosophical mechanics, when you try to get all of it from a single concept of a mechanical object, as it were, versus principal approaches to philosophical mechanics, where you try to get the whole picture out of a principle, broadly speaking, some kind of a law. And again, these projects ultimately run out of steam by the early 19th century for various reasons that we explain in the last chapter. But the idea being that from Descartes to, post-Napoleonic France, the project seems to have promise. And it's not just, campus metaphysicians or, people who draw a paycheck from teaching college students that, pursue it. It's practically everybody who counted as anybody back in Europe, at least in theoretical philosophy and exact science. So that's it. I guess I've said too much.
Well, it was great. No, thank you. It was not too much. I have several questions. And maybe I could start with one. But if there is anybody who wants to react immediately to what Katherine and Marius have just said, you're most welcome to jump in immediately. But no, so I will go ahead and ask you something which has to do with what you said, like coming from different backgrounds and with different questions to this project, and with something that you write in chapter 1 of the book, in the paragraph on methods. You state, which is quite clear from what you do afterwards and what you said now, that your endeavor is not a work in intellectual history, neither a work in the history of material culture. But so my reflection is, the texts and the authors and the contents that you discuss from a different perspective than intellectual history and cultural history are usually the subject matter of history of science, so which is now quite largely intellectual history and cultural history, basically. So it's the history of science adopting a philosophical approach is quite a minority, let's say, at least in the broad community of the history of science. If you look at the major reviews in the history of science, they're doing cultural history or intellectual history or something like that. So, also in the paragraph on the audience, you do not mention historians of science as a potential audience, but historians of modern philosophy, philosophers of science and of physics, and so on. So my question, which is quite broad and naive, is whether you think you have anything to say, or to like a possible dialogue with historians of science in the sense of intellectual history and cultural history, which is a large part of the community, or you think that you're pursuing something completely different, which has nothing to do with history of science or history of knowledge as it is done nowadays at many colleges and universities worldwide.
Do you want to say something, Marius, first?
Yeah. First about the dominance of cultural history. Yeah, in a way, there's been some journal capture. So they got ISIS, I guess, made it unreadable for the likes of me. But there's still a couple of journals where, old school internalist history of science still happens, like Annals of Science that Monty Feingold and Jed now run. So yeah, for now, I think we've become a bit of a minority, but things turn around. All this excitement about culture runs out of steam by the time people get old and they have to train grad students, and their grad students will rebel against them and decide to read Mach again or Trustel. But to be honest, I know that to a man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So they'll want to, push this history of culture and sociability and stuff on us. But these tools are just not very useful as, tools for research when it comes to the whole problematic that we look at. These notions, slippery and mushy, they are, scientific culture, material culture, culture of sociability. You see that I speak with a lot of contempt about it, and it's just like they don't do much for you. So if the tool is weak or useless, like I don't need to use it. We have better tools. And the tools are, the methods of old school, strongly internalist history of physics. And there are some externalist approaches to history that we use, and they're primarily institutional history. But we just scratched the surface there, because that's work for an entire group of young scholars to do. How exactly the creation of these two things, the three academies of science in Paris, London, and St. Petersburg, how exactly that shaped research agendas, or served to welcome certain approaches, or rule out other ways of doing things. That's important work to be done, and that's it's not history of ideas, it's not internal, but you can call it part of material culture in a very broad sense. So we found that angle useful. But on the other hand, we just thought, if we carry out this project and if it works, if it shows that it yields results, it might be an invitation to because I mean, we've been doing this culture of science thing for what, 40-50 years now. I mean, would be nice to get past it, because when I was at Caltech, they told me after grad school, don't do the philosophy of yesterday, do the philosophy of tomorrow. And that's been my impulse. I mean, I'd rather not do what's been done already. So fighting words, as they say in Ireland or whatever. But yeah,
I think your point is a fair one, that we don't mention historians of science, and I think maybe what Marius has said answers the reason why, and that is because, at least in the environment I'm working in, the historians of science won't recognize what we're doing as history of science. And that's because of the moment that we're located in, and I think it's a shame, but yeah.
Yeah, it's very clear. Well, Karin has a question, so thank you for the answer. But Karin, please go ahead.
Yes, so thanks for your introductions, and I guess there are many other questions. Yes, but maybe I have one small question out of curiosity, and I was wondering if you could say a bit more about the way you cooperated, and who contributed what, if that's at all possible to clarify. But then I have a second question, which is a real one. And is connected to Marco's question, in the sense of, well, my question is basically, how do you conceive of your own approach in somewhat more positive terms than you laid out in the first chapter? And I guess that if I had read the whole book, I would probably understand better what you're actually doing. But I had the impression that you start from a very limited number of features of the theory, or bunch of theories you want to explore, and then go to the actual text and actual discussions to measure them, as it were, in light of the features or parameters that you identified, as it were, a priori. And I thought this was very interesting, because it seemed to be a way of doing, let's say, history of philosophy, or history of philosophy and science, that itself starts from principles. So it does not proceed empirically, but starts from a set of features that you identify, and that you use as a strong guiding thread to interpret a great manifold of theories and debates. And to me, it suggested to me a certain attempt to apply let's say, the principle approach to the history. Yes, as opposed to applying it to make sense of the physical universe. And I do not know if you have been discussing this. Yeah. So the nature of your own methodology, which seems to be at least at some point to start from a limited set of principles. Katherine, you're smiling, yeah? So maybe you want to respond to this.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting. So we did talk a lot all the time about our methods, and we were like very reflective. And so I think what we did was so obviously everyone brings their own questions to whatever they're reading. So we were trying to be very honest about that, but also reading to try to understand what problems it was the people that whose materials we're reading, what problems they were trying to address. And then the book is the interplay of those two things. And I think that's an honest approach to reading any kind of material, is to strive as hard as you can to understand what was at stake for the person who was putting their life and energy into the project that they're doing, whilst also recognizing that you yourself, inevitably, you're bringing your own, you're situated somewhere too. So you're bringing your own perspectives and questions and situation to the materials. So we talked a lot about the interplay of those two things. And that's part of what you're seeing in the introduction, is an attempt to be explicit about that and honest about that. I'm very quite interested in this idea that, oh, look, there's an analogy here with the constructive principle approach. So that's what was making me smile, because I had not thought about that at all. And I think that is very interesting. But it's super interesting, this idea that because the one thing the principle approach does is it brings a lens to materials. So and we're conscious that we're doing that, and it makes certain things visible, other things invisible, and that's a very important part of what anyone does when they write about a period of history. So I'm now thinking about that analogy, and that's what was making me smile.
So if I can add one more thing about this analogy, so in a way, what you're trying to do maybe is to be, as it were, the Newtonians of the modern history of physics. So not of nature, but to look at the historical developments from a kind of quasi-Newtonian perspective.
I would like to say that we're being the Du Châteletans of this, because she was so good at looking at the multiple perspectives and trying to see what was at stake, and then move things forward in light of what was at stake from multiple perspectives. So that's what I would say. Very quickly, I expect Marius wants to talk about this, but just about how we work together, because you asked about that to start with. So this book took 8 years or so to write. And we worked very closely together right from the beginning. We met often weekly on Zoom or whatever to talk about stuff. We also met up in person. We discussed, revised everything together. So there are some chapters that in the end, one of us took responsibility for writing, or certain sections, one of us took responsibility for writing, but we were both involved in then thinking about how that fits into the whole and all this kind of thing. So it was a real intellectual partnership, the like of which I've never experienced before, and it was pretty amazing, actually. So I don't know if Marius wants to add on either topic, but
maybe a couple of words about method. Not a lot, because we can talk forever. It's like the topic that has no end. But to keep with the analogy, if we didn't take a principal approach to these sources, Karen, what would you say the alternative is? In a way, you can't interpret the entire past, because it's enormous. You have to, the historian's task, you can try to avoid making judgment calls, but then you're not gonna do any work anymore. So the historian has to make some choices, and stand by those choices, because again, the past is enormous.
Yes.
So when you make those choices, you'll have to choose certain criteria of relevance, certain strategies for reducing complexity, as it were. Where do they come from? because the past doesn't suggest them to you. Again, the past being manifold and very complex, you have to, make that choice. So what led you to it? What guided you to?
Yeah.
You can't do inductive reasoning like with material objects, because thankfully in mechanics, there's only 4 properties that you have to keep track of, distance, time, mass, and force. So it's easy to do inductive reasoning there. But with the works of men and women, it's a lot of variables. So
yeah. But don't get me wrong, Marius, don't get me wrong, because I'm very much in favor of this principled approach. Yes, that's what I liked about the way you set up your first chapter, where you say, look, it cannot be just one parameter, but we need to have these multiple parameters that suffices for us as a kind of perspective or lens that suffices to at least limit the amount of material and compare the various positions in these terms. So I like that a lot, and I think one could maybe even be more radical in this regard. Yeah, so I think it's just summarizing everything that we've done is not satisfactory at all. So yeah, I appreciate this. Yeah.
So also there is an inductive basis, as it were, to what we did, and it's the fact that these people, 12, 13 different figures, keep talking about these issues. They keep asking, so what is the nature of body? How do bodies act on each other? Even people that had never talked to one another or never read anything by the other folks, somehow these 4 questions, the sub questions associated with the problem of body, keeps popping up. So that's, as it were, the empirical basis from which we operate. And also, more broadly speaking, the the hard task that we faced of choosing some methods and making sure that they work together. It's the problem that anybody who does HBS faces. If you do history and philosophy of science and want to do them, coherently, as it were, as opposed to, I'm going to write a chapter of pure history and then I'm going to write another chapter of just like analytic philosophy. If you want to, make them one project as opposed to juxtaposing results, there too you'll have the same problem. And likewise for historians of philosophy, as it were, especially if you plan to speak to modern metaphysicians or contemporary analytic philosophers, you can't just do history of philosophy like Winkelmann in the 19th century, just like summarizing the past, as it were, or trying to group people into schools, because that's not going to get traction anymore with 21st century people. So you have to use some of their concepts and see if you can export them without doing violence to the text, as it were, onto these early modern works. So our problem is generally the problem of any scholar, historian that tries to speak to the present too, in a sense.
So thanks. And next question is Stefan's. So please, Stefan.
Yes, hello, good morning. First of all, I would like to congratulate you for completing this book, because you have tried to make sense of really complex, messy, technical material. So that is a major accomplishment, I think. So I really look forward to reading the book. Then first question and that I had was, you briefly referred to it in the introduction, namely you refer to to normal science, and you indicate that your book goes against the view that 18th century physics or 18th century mechanics corresponds to what has been called normal science. And of course, you are aware that other scholars have made this claim before. For instance, John L. Greenberg, in his fantastic book on how scholars in the 18th century have tried to make sense or tried to trace the shape of the earth. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on that. And I think Marius has started with what he said in his introductory words, namely there are different ontologies at play, different laws. But I was wondering if you could tell a bit more about how your study goes against the view that 18th century mechanics was corresponds to normal science, because that's something that really interests me to, rethink what happened during the 18th century, and particularly in mechanics, which has been neglected, of course. So I'm particularly interested in that.
Katherine addressed this question, I think, a couple of years ago during a keynote address. So in a way, she already has the answer. And if you'd like to say a couple of things, I'm also happy to say a couple of things. And
do you want to just elaborate on what you said a bit about in your opening remarks, and then maybe I'll say something?
Yeah, so very loosely speaking, because with Kuhn, the picture is always very loose and fuzzy. The idea was, there's the revolutionary period where people fight over, what the, the new orthodoxy is supposed to be, what principles, what methods, what list of problems deemed, canonical, what questions worth asking or, regarded as allowed to be asked. And by the time the revolutionary period ends, normal science begins. And yes, Kuhn's assumption is that, the framework, as it were, the list of basics, basic concepts, important questions, and methods for tackling these questions has been sorted. You don't question that anymore. You just go on to solve problems. And that's just not just in the early 18th century, but these things don't become settled until at least the early 19th century. And by the time they do become more or less settled in, early 19th century France, there isn't a single community that pursues, research problems based on these, established basics. There's at least 3 or maybe 4, depending on, how you count them, communities of research working with different foundations, as it were. So within these smaller communities, early 19th century groups of research, yes, the basics, as it were, are regarded as, settled. But there isn't a single overall group, pan-European group of research that you can call, practitioners of classical mechanics. Because if you ask what do they have in common other than, they do things quantitatively, that's the only thing they have in common. Other than that, they're split into, again, 3 to 4 different communities of research. So in that sense, that's not normal science at all. Again, if I remember from Kuhn, normal science mostly amounts to, you take grad students and you ask them to solve the problems at the back of the chapter. But there are no textbooks in this period. The first textbooks, get written when the École Polytechnique gets created in 1794. And so again, early 19th century. Nobody had grad students in mechanics until the creation of the Imperial Academy of France by Napoleon in Paris. So that's the first time anyone had grad students in mechanics. Then how do you do normal science before that? Seeing as, you know, these people who developed the theory in the 1700s, if you're lucky enough to get recognized as smart and live not far from somebody who knew real math, they might informally teach you, you know, how derivation and integration works, and, you know, maybe even point you to a couple of important books that you should read and then try to, you know, build on. I mean, that's how Lagrange and D'Alembert learned mechanics and started doing it. You know, a couple of priests told them, "Oh, look, there are these books. You know, I see you're good at math. You should study them." So I don't know. Is that normal science?
So can I like chip in another important thread of this, and that is this, you know, learning as a philosopher of physics, I get taught this phrase classical mechanics and classical physics, and they get used interchangeably in the way that I'd learned about, if I learned anything at all about the 18th century. And that is just a huge mistake. So on the one hand, there is classical mechanics, and that might have gone on just fine as a like subdiscipline of mathematics. But that's not what happened. And looking back, the reason these two phrases can get used interchangeably is we've come to think of classical mechanics as being a sort of as a branch of physics. But that takes a century of work, and that's certainly not in place in the early 18th century. And Newton's Principia is misleading. Looking back from here, we think of Newton's Principia as being this model that does bring mechanics and physics together. And there's a sense in which it does, but it's also happening at a time where that just doesn't exist as a single discipline. And so the history of the 18th century could have gone differently in some sense of as an available option as far as what people knew at the beginning of the 18th century. It could have been the case that the philosophers would have gone on to provide a notion of body that was completely adequate for Newton's Principia and didn't require people from mechanics to do any work at all. They could have just provided this notion of body, and it turns out that it works just fine for Newton's Principia, for planets. It works fine for the ongoing project of classical mechanics, and the two disciplines just carried on as they were, one as a subdiscipline of philosophy and one as a subdiscipline of mathematics. But that's not what happened, and it's not what happened because there's all this, you know, there isn't normal science. We don't know what the objects are that we're talking about. We don't know what the appropriate methods are for investigating these objects. We don't have agreement about what questions we're supposed to be addressing and what would count as answering them. So if none of those things are in place, then normal science certainly isn't in place. And classical physics, as we tend to kind of, as at least from a philosophy of physics community perspective, as we tend to sort of look back on terrestrial physics in the 18th century, it doesn't exist. It's a myth. So that's how I would think about it, yeah.
Yes, well, thank you. Yeah, that helps.
Thank you very much. Next on the list is Henny. Please.
Yeah, I'm also not very used to Teams, so I was searching the unmute, the button to unmute. I have a more detailed question, perhaps, although it's a bit in line with what you discussed. So it's in the first text, so from the introduction on page 21 in the document. So you give 3 reasons to take an historical approach, and in the second reason, it's really a detail, but because I'm interested in this, it struck my eye. And so you said the second reason is that the contours of body are historically sensitive, and then you say how body is formulated, its place in the system of knowledge, the preferred heuristics for solving it, and etc. And I was wondering, its place in the system of knowledge. So this formulation is quite strong. So to talk here of a system of knowledge, it seems to presuppose a kind of unified picture And this seems to be a metaphysical supposition that is not really argued for. And I would say in line of what you're explaining. So, for example, your the anti-Kuhnian strand of your research, and also the distinctions you make between physics and mechanics. And then, of course, you also explain how there was a tentative to unify them. But this very, let's say, general formulation, the place in the system of knowledge, it's both a bit vague, I think, and also metaphysically quite heavy. So I wanted to ask you, is that something you endorse, really, that there is this kind of systematic system?
So I speak for myself, and then Marius can say, I don't take this phrase to be metaphysically heavy. So I take it to be the case to treat it lightly. It means that whoever's like approaching these kinds of questions in natural philosophy has some kind of way of connecting the different things that they're doing, and some kind of way of thinking in an open-ended way, and not necessarily in some very precise way about the different issues and the different questions they're addressing. And it happens that at the time, it's completely widespread that in natural philosophy, the problematic is formulated, okay, this is the area of philosophy that studies bodies and causes and the nature and properties of bodies and the way in which they cause things. So it comes at the very beginning of natural philosophy that we should be asking those questions about bodies. So that places the problem of bodies in a particular location with respect to the inquiries that we're carrying out. And then this, why this is really super important, one reason this is super important for us is that by the time you get to the end of the 18th century, the objects of this sort of physically informed mechanics that's being done in the late 18th century no longer takes bodies as the primary object of inquiry. So this transformation in what counts as I think that's the best phrase, the primary object of inquiry, is part of what's of interest to us, and why we say that, look, this problem of bodies is situated at a particular moment and takes a particular place in how people are thinking about knowledge of the natural world at the time. So it's that sense of system of knowledge, not a really like heavy kind of metaphysically loaded notion. That that's at least the way that I was thinking about it, and I think so for Marius too, but I should let him say for himself.
Yeah, as far as I was concerned, system there just meant loosely how, the relevant things in a broad sense hang together in a broad sense. But I didn't pursue some kind of a Fichte Schelling, this great project, Begründung aus dem Ich or something. No, it's just like, don't pursue unconnected things.
Can I ask another question now, or should I wait, Marco?
No, go ahead, please.
Another question I have is on page 5 of the 3rd chapter, and it's here. It's I have a question about. So you're talking about Kiel. So Kiel talks about behavior of a string that is fixed at 2 ends and then released, and then he will use the description of the changes of the shape of the string to provide a cause for the fact that a body, an impinging body, is repelled. And then you say this is a transition from geometric considerations to kinematic considerations. And of course, I see what you mean, but I have difficulties to conceive of this as geometric considerations, because this is a kind of observation, or you could say a description of a changing shape that is physical. And it also depends already on the nature of the body itself, namely the string. So I found this a bit, I mean, too fast to call this geometric, and it comes back on the next page, the second paragraph, where you say he classified them as such based on the geometric criterion of the shape behavior during collision. Yeah, that's just a worry. It's also a very small detail, but I don't know of any kind of geometry or any kind of, well, let's say this kind of description that would be called geometry. Perhaps closest would be Leonardo da Vinci's solid geometry, where he describes how a certain figure, three-dimensional figure, can keep the same volume but change into another shape. But that's clearly not what is at stake here. So again, it's really a very detailed, but is this let's say a use that is somewhere widely adopted? Does Keel himself call this geometrical?
So I'm trying to find exactly where you are, but I haven't. But I will in a minute. Let me just speak generally about how we're using this terminology. So the terminology here doesn't apply to using like axioms of geometry to do reasoning. What we're talking about here is the descriptive way in which some process is being described. So where we're talking about geometrical considerations, we just mean what's being discussed here is the shape of the body in question and changes in shape. And that's a different thing from talking from the kinematic description, which is talking about the motions and the changes in motion. And that's a different thing from talking about a dynamical description that then brings in forces. And what we're interested in is how you move from one kind of description to another and what warrants those inferences. So that's why we're using that terminology and talking about what Keel's doing, because we're interested in where the kinematic assumptions come in and where the dynamical assumptions come in, given that he starts from a geometrical description, and by which we mean given that he starts by just talking about the shape of the string or just talking about the shape and the way that the shapes of bodies change during collision. How do you get from the idea that a body changes shape in collision to some conclusion about what the subsequent motions will be? Yeah, so it doesn't speak exactly perhaps to the specific sentence that you were referring to, but that's
Yes,
what we're doing in those passages.
It does. So I understood, of course, and I mean, I also read it in this sense, but I just had to worry if shape description can be called geometrical.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a detail. So
yeah. Yes, they can. And by the way, because the only shapes they look at is spheres, so spheres have been objects of geometry since Archimedes. So, but the reason why we introduced this, these two terms was because we thought it's a way to clarify the muddled discussions of these people at the time, early 18th century discussions. So the topic, the object of inquiry is impact collision. And they use these terms, elastic, soft, hard. And when you look at what they mean by it, you see that they use these terms in two semantic regimes, as it were. Sometimes by elastic or hard, they mean what the shape of the body does during the collision. Elastic bodies get smushed, but then they regain their shape. Hard bodies don't change shape. But then in other contexts or right away, They also talk about elastic, hard, soft in terms of how they move, not what the shape does, but how they move once the impact is over. So, these terms, elastic, inelastic, hard, soft, are, fundamentally equivocal. So we thought we can, disambiguate and keep separate things separately by talking about, geometric senses of elastic, hard, soft, and kinematic.
But you're right. Sorry. You're right that these are our labels, right? This is our way of trying to clarify, what is otherwise ambiguous in the terminology. So it's not that they say that this is geometric reasoning and this is kinematical reasoning. Those terms are not, used in that way by the actors themselves.
Yeah, thanks. And also congratulations with your book.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, all of you.
The next question is from Musa Mohammedian, please.
Oh, hi. Am I audible? Hi,
Yep.
Katherine. Hey, Mo. Congratulations for the wonderful book, and thanks for the organizer. So I will be very brief. I have one specific question about one of those, decisions that you as the writers had to make, and that is about the kind of those couple of names that you bring together in one chapter. I was because it's very important that when you read someone, you imagine them in conversation with someone else. They are not talking in the vacuum. So Du Châtelet and Euler, of course, Newton and Leibniz has been always coupled together. Du Châtelet and Euler, Kant and Boscovich. What was the kind of I don't want to say principle, but what were you thinking that who are the best two people to study together among these 12, 13 figures that we are going to study? How did you come to a decision that how to bring these two into a conversation in order to clarify this scene in the episode of the history? And by the way, Marius, just want to say that the point that you made about the current status of the history of science, warmly received. So.
Yeah, us at the edges of the field, the people at Oxford or Harvard, they probably would wave us out of the room, but
I know.
at the periphery of empire, things are rumbling.
No, well, I mean, it's a very good point that we as philosophers of science also need a kind of history that is usable for our purpose, and it's really hard to find in the mainstream history of science something that we can use in order to clarify philosophical perception. So anyway, thank you so much.
Absolutely. Musa, it's so great to see you. It's been so long.
Yeah, it's been so.
Yeah.
Hopefully in Vienna, hopos. So.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Okay, so your question was about how do we decide who to put together. So that changed a lot and multiple times over and over again as we rewrote and reorganized and restructured, as we read more materials and tried to see what the arc of the story was going to be for us. So it was driven by the problem narrative, as it were, of the book. So people moved around a lot, and the reason they ended up where they were is because as we tried to have this settle down into who's dealing with what aspect of this problem and moving it forward in which ways that take us to the next thing that we want to write about, that's where they go in the story, and that's how they end up together. This was not something so we had an idea beforehand about who would go where, and it was destroyed multiple times as we learned more and did more and worked harder on the issues.
But I would say it's also true that sometimes if you're in this broad problematic of the structure of natural philosophy in these 2 centuries, certain figures kind of naturally suggest themselves as fit for pairing. For instance, D'Alembert and Lagrange could have been paired if we could afford to explain them in just one chapter, because they all pursue this joint idea of you start with statics and laws of statics, and you find a way to reduce dynamics to it, to turn dynamical processes into a weird species of static equilibrium, as it were. So there's a intuition there that they share, and a commitment, as it were, to showing that, you know, we can regard mechanics as unified from this angle. But, you know, individually, both of them did so much that you just can't squeeze these two guys into a single chapter.
And yeah, I mean, there's a version of the outline of this where D'Alembert and Boscovich are in together, because I think Boscovich is providing trying to provide a integrated philosophical mechanics that builds on D'Alembert's mechanics, but that just adds too much again. There's another version of things where I've gone out of blank now at another old version, but I've forgotten. Oh yeah, where Maupertuis is originally, I thought he was going to be a much bigger presence in this book, and he absolutely could have been. Where, you know, so he's very, very much this person who straddles the interesting causes as well as working on mechanics, but just, you know, not everything fits, and he ended up getting squeezed out of several places where he naturally fits in the book because we just couldn't put everything in. So yeah.
Sorry, Marco.
No worries.
But we love him very much.
Actually, I also have a question, which is not on Maupertuis specifically, but well, on chapter 2, which I saw from the table of contents, and I'm pretty much interested in, especially this 17, 24, and 25 prize competitions, because actually Maupertuis, in a famous letter, talks about this competition and says that there were philosophers as crazy as to claim in that competition that no our bodies can exist, and he makes the name of Johann Bernoulli. So Bernoulli in that occasion was so with subtleties claim for the impossibility of hard bodies. So I was wondering whether Johann Bernoulli is cited and discussed in that chapter, and one of the reasons why. So of course you cannot squeeze in all the important figures of 18th century mechanics and mathematics in 300 or 400 pages, but one reason why I was interested in this kind of figures like Bernoulli is also because in the first footnote of chapter 3, you talk about categories: Cartesians, Newtonians, Leibnizians, how they are heuristically useful, and sometimes they have blurry boundaries, but still you use them, as I do in my own research, by the way. And I was wondering, somebody like Johann Bernoulli, where would you put him? So whether these categories would work in a case like Bernoulli's or not. And it's just.
Is that for me or?
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. So I, for one, am not a fan of these labels after 1720. I think that by around 1720, they completely run out of steam. And Johann is a case in point, because, you know, in the early, thankfully, he lived a long time, unlike his poor brother. So he produced a lot. In the early parts of his career, he very much pursued the Leibnizian agenda. There's a couple of strong senses in which you can cast this guy as Leibnizian. So he takes theorems from book 1 of the Principia and shows that you can rederive them from Leibniz's calculus. Or you can do inverse proofs, you know, where Newton has if P then Q, Johann proves that if Q then P. And he tries to argue that you can only do that with Leibniz's version of the calculus. And the vis viva business too, that he pushes hard for it. And this idea that fundamental scales matter is, you know, elastic. And you can think of it as, you know, springs, elastic springs that get compressed and then relaxed. And this is all out of Leibniz's wheelhouse. But by later, as they, you know, the spotlight of research turns elsewhere, for instance, to, you know, hydrodynamics or fluid motions, he realizes that, you know, some of these Leibnizian tools are just not going to yield fruit. So he uses what looks like straight up, you know, F equals ma, orthodox Newtonian concepts and methods. In fact, you know, Euler's discovery that, you know, you can use a sort of generalized version of F equals ma to quantify the motion of a particle of fluid in a container, for instance. Johann Bernoulli gave him that idea in some early papers from the late 1730s. It's a sort of, that insight is buried in there. And I'm not saying that Johann explicitly thought, oh, there's a lot more in the Principia than, you know, we've thought. Here, I will extend it to. I think he just grappled with that problem, you know, fluid motion on its own. And he realized that this approach that in retrospect you can call Newtonian is the one that actually works. It yields results. But not because he had, you know, changed loyalties. In general, I don't like to do this like armchair sociology where you read people's minds 300 years after the fact and, you know, you suppose that, you know, they like this guy, they didn't like that guy. I'd rather look at, you know, what they do. So for that reason, I don't know, I don't have a 17th century label that fits to Johann.
But there is lots about him in chapter 2.
Okay. Thanks. There is a question from Robert.
Hi, Rob.
Myself. There I am. Now I'm unmuted. Hi, Marius. Katherine, good to see you. I have a question that's outside the scope of your book, but maybe you ran across some considerations in deciding the scope of your book. Now, if one wants to, I mean, the word body and the word matter can't be synonymous because one is a count noun and the other is a mass term. But if you were to say, what is the nature of body? I think you would be taken in the 17th century, in the 18th century, to be asking the same question as what is the nature of matter? Now, furthermore, chemistry seems to have stake in terms of what is the nature of matter. I mean, you want to know what are the elements and so on. And I mean, when I was a kid, in terms of wanting to know what everything is made of, the discipline you looked at was towards chemistry. So my question is when you're looking at the pursuit of the nature of body in connection with physics, do you find any interaction with the chemical tradition?
So you're right that this was part of the decision tree in pursuing our project. So one of the things that is in place at least by the early 18th century, and I think this goes back at least to the Huygens, Renan, Wallace discussion of collisions, is whether we should start with bodies and enumerate their properties, powers, or whether we need to give an underlying theory of matter out of which the bodies are made. And that would be one way to do the constructive approach to solving the problem of collisions, for example, would be to start with your matter theory. And on the basis of that, build the bodies that are then going to undergo the collisions. And there's a question about how to fit that together. So they do come apart. You don't have to start there. And there are people in our book who don't start there. They just want to start with the bodies and enumerate their properties and move on from there. But then, there is this other tradition, right? The chemical tradition. And the question is, how does that bear on this topic? And we did make the decision to focus our attention on how the integration comes about between physics and mechanics as a tradition in mathematics. And that forces us to, doesn't force us, but within the scope of the book, then encouraged us to pay attention to the lines of development in natural philosophy that are part of this thing that come together in the late 18th, early 19th century, that chemistry is not a part of. That takes longer. So there is a separate strand of development in the 19th century. One of the interesting things about the 19th century is the ways in which these different strands of development come together into what's going to get called physics, including things that come out of the chemical tradition, but they're not there in the particular strand of the story that we chose to tell. I don't know if Marius wants to add to that, but yeah.
Yeah. Good. So maybe two quick things. One is, if anything, the influence, I think, goes the other way. So from, a, a physics of matter towards chemistry. So for instance, for a while, for some decades, there was something called, Newtonian chemistry, where they tried to use this image of like mass points interacting by action at a distance forces to ground chemistry on it. But it's really just manifestos, because nobody was able to do any of that in practice. So they say it in prefaces, we should be Newtonian chemists, or we should follow Newton's lead and stuff. But again, you can't do any of that until like mid to late 19th century times. So it's the influence, or the direction of influence is mostly ideological, not in terms of pragmatic achievement.
Okay, good. That's interesting. Because I was thinking about the empirical line, so the experimental line, and how the experimental line in the sort of mid-19th, getting towards the mid-19th century, the work that goes on with the studies of heat and also the studies of chemistry, how all those have to come together in sort of the 1840s, but they haven't done yet. But I hadn't thought about the kind of attempts to do a mathematization of chemistry in the Newtonian tradition.
So the French called chemistry special physics until the early to mid 19th century. And for them, it was like, if you can establish anything solid in just the doctrine of body, then hopefully you might be able to export some of that to special physics, but not so much, have chemistry feed into the broader matter theory. That's one thing. And the other thing is, I would like to say that, unlike matter, bodies have shapes. It's part of how we count them, by the way, because we can tell different shapes in space. And in this century, they have boundaries. When, action by contact, when two chunks of matter interact on the, common boundary or along the bounding surface between them, that becomes a huge agenda for research. You get none of it in Newton because, planets are far apart, and also he couldn't have done action by contact even if he tried to. You need partial derivatives and stuff. But once people start looking at fluids and extended elastic solids, you can't just say matter anymore. You have to say body, because they have bounding surface. They have, and
well,
because
Descartes
of that,
doesn't, right? I mean, there is the tradition that lasts roughly until 1750 of that the world is a plenum versus those who accept atoms and void. Now, the plenum view dies out, but and you also have these questions about what sorts of things are bodies. Is light a body? Is heat a body? That sort of thing.
yeah. But that's the whole question of whether subtle fluids count as a type of matter, or they're just some kind of a placeholder for, we don't know what these things are, but we're just going to use this portmanteau phrase. We don't really mean that they're fluids.
Well,
but
they're not solids.
Yeah, but do they have mass? I mean, they carry momentum, but they don't have themselves mass because they don't resist, they don't exert drag forces on things that pass through them. So it's unclear in what sense they count as fluids. They don't stay confined within a solid reservoir that can pass through anything. So, you know.
But again,
Yes.
I don't.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say again, these different kind of lines of things. We're well into the 1800s before the attempt to really bring these together in a systematic way gets any purchase. And that's so you asked at the beginning about the decision making, and the decision making involves classical mechanics, as Marius said, having a fragmentation of the potential ontologies, including a continuum-based thing. So there's potential there for using that mathematization to be able to talk about these different ideas, but it doesn't. I mean, so Euler, as we know, really struggled to provide some kind of ether notion that would do justice to gravity, enable him to unify that with his mathematization of gravity. It's too late so the strands are there and we're aware of them, but it's too late for our purposes for them to come together in a way that's meaningful for the questions that we were interested in, I think.
Okay, thank you.
So we have Ovidiu next on the list. Please.
Thank you very much. So first of all, apologies. I have lag issues, and I don't think I followed the whole discussion. So one question like connected to the last one is right. So I mean, very intuitively, the difference between like matter and bodies seems to be right, that there should be some sort of individuation criteria, right, for bodies, which might not be there in terms of what matter is, right? And you have this distinction, right, between the rather constructive approach to the problem of bodies, right, specifically in the problem of collisions, which has a very strong sense and a weaker sense, the stronger sense being like, you know, you derive what a body is in collisions from matter theory, as it were. I got it right. Yeah, so one question which I kind of had was this. So what about all the metaphysics of bodies? So questions like parts and wholes, questions like the mereology of bodies, like are there actual parts, are there potential parts, and so on. Do you think these can play a role from the like bottom-up matter theory towards the problem of bodies, or are these like kept on a very principled way of talking about bodies? Or just more generally, where does the metaphysics of body, particularly like in the 17th century and maybe end of the 17th century, where does this fit in the whole framework?
So the way I've understood the history is that it's this question of individuation is a bottom-up question in the 17th century and in the early 18th century. So questions about how we do identity and individuation of bodies is going to be something that the metaphysicians are concerned with, and the metaphysicians are concerned with building up from some account of the nature of matter in order to have bodies that can then be individuated and have identity over time. And one of the things that is super interesting about Newton, I think, and also about Euler, and then that the principal approach really makes vivid is that we can tackle questions of parts and wholes and of mereology from a principled approach. We can ask these questions about what counts as a whole with respect to my theory, what is an object of my theory, what makes it a whole, what makes its parts, using resources from the laws or from the principles that we use to construct the theory, without needing to bring in extra resources from the bottom-up kind of metaphysics. So this is one of the really interesting philosophical shifts, I think, that we see happening as part of this 18th century story that Marius and I are trying to tell.
So a couple of more things, if I may, or yeah. For one, we have a book on parts and wholes in early modern natural philosophy. It's that older thing by Thomas Holden from 2004. So we didn't want to write that book again, or even a sequel to it. You know, that Holden has kind of mostly sorted out those issues, and we I for one regard them as, well understood at this point, as far as, early modern metaphysics goes. For another, this whole thing about parts and wholes seems to me a little bit of a forced export from, people who like Princeton, Rutgers, University of Southern California, analytic metaphysics of, is a whole a void, holes and pockets and absences and parts and wholes. Yeah, I guess, all these metaphysicians need something to talk about once they're done talking about modality. But, that's not a reason for us to, export that back onto the poor, mathematicians of 18th century science.
Right, but just a very short follow-up. So of course, but the people in the 17th century did talk a lot about parts and wholes.
Yeah, and so I kind of disagree with Marius. I disagree with Marius about Holden having covered everything. He covered everything from, given the resources that the people at the time thought they had available, but he completely misses the significance of the arrival of a kind of principal approach to theorizing. And so, Marius, I think your perspective is a natural one from where we're situated now, but wasn't a natural one in the early 18th century and isn't obvious to some of our metaphysical colleagues. And so there is a responsibility on us to show how the philosophical debate is shifted by what happens in the 18th century. And so I think, it would be great if someone went back to Holden and picked up the story that he's told and said, look, there's this whole other way of approaching parts and wholes that becomes available by what's done in the 18th century, and that metaphysicians, in the 21st century have not taken on board, and we need to do that.
May I have just a very short follow-up, Marco?
Yeah, yes, for sure.
Yeah, so would it be maybe fair to say, given that, Holden's story keeps the meteorological debates within matter theory, right? For most of the 17th century, would it be fair to say that, discussions about the metaphysics of substances or bodies, like parts and wholes and so on, was this one of the ways in which the problem of bodies kind of went up from the constitutive approach to the constitutive, what was the constructive approach, right, towards the more principled approach, thereby going like further into the problem of objects, as you call it?
Yes.
Is this a right way of putting it?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
well,
with a Marius finger by the look of it.
Yeah. Yes and no. So if I may have a sort of follow-up to both of you, there is a way in which you can see this question of, parts and wholes, whether they're potential or actual. It still haunts, or you still have to deal with it if you take a principal approach to things. And it's very oblique and kind of subtle. I didn't go into it in the chapter on Lagrange, but that's where it stares you in the face. Because if you take a principal approach to unifying theory, you have to write down an expression that holds for any mechanical system. So it's going to have to cover more than one body or more than one thing that interacts. Well, if they're mass points, the mathematics that you need for that is going to be like summation, capital sigma, uppercase sigma, where you sum over discrete objects. But if it's continuous, you need the snaky as the S of integration. So can you really write a single law that's valid for any mechanical system and not have to choose between these two, sigma or integration S, and not have to commit yourself to, at least something about the parts whole structure of, mechanical systems? There's some math that helps you get over it, but it gets developed, at the end of the 19th century. It's still just integration theory, where you don't have to answer the question. It's just one framework that lets you work with both actual and potential parts. But until then, it's a live question. I didn't, you know, touch upon it in chapter 11 because it wasn't, you know, we didn't have the room for it. But if somebody wishes to pursue it, you know.
But don't you think, I mean, already so I think the actual potential parts distinction just stops being interesting. That's one of the consequences of these changes. And don't you think that already in Euler, the way that Euler makes what counts as a part and what counts as a whole dependent on the theory and the context and the problem that you're trying to solve, that's already present. So it becomes like inescapable perhaps by the time you get to Lagrange, but I think it's already present to some extent in Newton. It's clear. I think Euler's explicit about it. So I think that strand of once you make your parts wholes theory, your account of parts and wholes and of matter and stuff dependent on your theory in the way that the principal approach requires, then this fragmentation and theory dependence and problem dependence, this kind of pluralistic thing is going to be one of the things that follows from it until we get some impossible grand unified theory of everything.
So I'm happy to grant that, you know, the distinction is context dependent. But then again, I was trying to raise the worry that if you think anyone who thinks you can unify mechanical theory from a principal approach, then you have to write a principle that's valid for all of them. And you won't be able to look away from the parts whole question, you know, at that point.
Yep.
Because a dynamical law that's valid for the entire spectrum of mechanical processes codifies some parts whole structure to it, and it's in the math. It's in the, you know, algebraic or differential additive structure of that you need to rely on.
Well, thank you very much for this this set of questions and replies. And Arnaud is next, so please.
Yeah, so good afternoon again, and thank you, Katherine and Marius. I really enjoyed the conversation. I very much looking forward to reading the book. Just a small note, actually, the person who was at the origin of this event is Olivier, who really wanted to have you online. And Olivier has now a power cut at home. He has no internet, so he will have to catch up the video, the recorded video. And he may ask you something because he's working on D'Alembert, actually. So perhaps he will ask you a question afterwards. So I have a very small question. I read what you wrote on Leibniz, and at the end of your chapter, it's a joke, huh? But you say, well, before moving to Hermann, you say, well, Leibniz failed, and then let's move on to Hermann because he failed to give a causal account of the collision of bodies. So since I'm reading Leibniz, and when someone says he fails, well, let's look a little bit closer. And perhaps he has another concept of causality, actually, of epistemic causality, which is not shared. And my question is about the whole book that I've not read, is do you have something on the different concepts of causality? And do you think it's part of the issue of having a unified mechanics because they are not dealing with the same thing? Is it part of the story or not?
So it is certainly part of the story that what counts as causation is up for grabs. And it's also part of the story that there's the bifurcation between these sort of general accounts of causation that apply to everything. So mind's body is God in the world, all that kind of thing, whether we're going to be occasionalists, what we're going to be. There's that debate that becomes increasingly irrelevant for the debate that we're interested in, because no matter whether people were occasionalists or influx theorists or whatever, they all were seeming to look for the same kind of thing with respect to collisions, the same kind of story. So there's some notion of secondary causation, some notion of material causation in the world that is in the vicinity, that has enough overlap but isn't clearly articulated between the different participants, that's at stake. And up for grabs and being worked out implicitly in these discussions about collision and the later discussions. So yes, I think causation is absolutely at stake, but not the one we typically hear about when philosophers are talking about causation in the 18th century. And it's one that needs to be looked at in the context of the particular problems that people were trying to solve and what causal notions they were relying on and to what extent those can be articulated consistently and coherently. So we mention this as an important kind of consequence of our book is, or I mean, that's too strong, but an important sort of thing that we don't do in our book, but that needs to be done in parallel with what we're doing is to look at exactly this issue, but we don't have it. We haven't worked it out explicitly. We've just said, hey, this is going on, and we really need to look at this as part of what we're interested in the 18th century.
Thank you.
But I didn't answer about Leibniz being wrong.
Oh,
Part of what we were hoping to do with this book is also open up some, fresh lines of research for young scholars. We're hoping to draw them in, hopefully not everybody will choose to do, parts and wholes in, a Lewisian framework or something. So we need talented young people to, come over to our side as well. So we thought maybe there are enough interesting things to follow up in this book that grad students looking for topics might.
thank you.
Yeah.
Great. And Karin, please.
Yes, I'm not going to ask a question about your current project, but I just wanted to to respond to what you just said, Marius, and I think it also applies to Katherine. I think that that this discussion that we had was really very interesting, and what I appreciate in particular was the type of reflection on what it means to do history of philosophy or history of science or something in between. And I think that regardless of the specific topic, that these reflections that we shared are very inspiring. And in particular to the more junior researchers who still need to, figure out all of this, just how to frame a project, how to determine what can be included, what needs to be left out, to what extent you need to explore the material, or to what extent you need to interpret the material through a kind of more or less fixed lens. So I think all of these questions are extremely relevant, and I think that you were able in your project, but also in discussion, to also share with us the complexities. Yes, and especially Katherine, when you mentioned how often you had to reframe the whole project and move stuff, I think that it's extremely helpful for us and maybe in particular for junior scholars to realize that this happens also at a very advanced level. Yeah, so I think it's particularly this kind of shared reflection that we value very much, and that will also inspire us going forward. Yeah, so thank you very much for this.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And I want to give Marius a big thank you for this, because he really, really pushed us to think, every time I thought I kind of got a handle on how we were doing things, he always had a but kind of question. So I really appreciated his insistence that we continue to problematize for ourselves what it is we were trying to do. So the dynamic of the book forced all this rewriting, but yeah, Marius was really good about making sure when we were doing that, we were also reflecting on the methodological questions.
Oh, thank you. But, if I can add a couple of words, here's why I did that, or here's how I came to, be this kind of guy that pushes for explicit discussion. After grad school, I worked in a place where philosophers of science had to coexist, live peacefully with straight up historians of physics. And because I liked the historians and I liked hanging out with them, I just realized these guys have their own different ways of doing things, looking at the same material that we philosophers look at, but they bring different tools to them. So my wheels began to spin about, what tools do we have for, making sense of these things. Which ones are better? Can you use a hammer and a sewing needle at the same time, as it were? Or, and the other reason why I did that is that many years, longer than I would like to remember, I did a master's in political theory in England. And that's where, as a master's student, you get taught a course on methods. They call it government in England for the, Brits in the room. And I was like, I was dumbfounded. I was like, what do you mean methods? I'm here to do research. But then you went on to grad school, you go on to grad school in philosophy and nobody teaches you that. In fact, a few years ago, I was having lunch with Andrew Janiak, and I just remarked casually, are we the only discipline in the 21st century that doesn't teach methods to their grad students? And, he rubbed his chin and was like, huh, never thought of it. But again, because us people who do history and philosophy of science, we have to think about these things. We don't get a choice. We don't have the luxury of just pretending that, there are no methods and you can do whatever you like. So that's one reason why these things were at the forefront of my mind as we were pursuing this project. And probably Rob would, have things to say too, because he also got trained by philosophers and also historians of physics. So, if you do HPS, you have to face up to it.
Well, thank you. We have, I think, a last question via video. Please.
Thanks. Yeah, so this probably goes back to Karin's first question of this evening. So Marius and Katherine, you have this analytical framework, right? Which you very nicely and very, very clearly spell out at the beginning. The problem of bodies, the problem of objects, problem of collisions, of constrained motions, and various approaches to the latter two, right? So in a way, I mean, this is related to Karin's point at the beginning, you can also read this framework as not as a principled approach, but as a constructive approach, right? You can read this framework as constantly going back and forth between the historical material and the analytical framework, and constantly kind of revising, one kind of revises the other, and so on. So my question is really very, very dumb and simple. So can you tell us a bit about the constant give or take, the constant, so how many times did you have to revise the framework in order to be kind of satisfied of what lenses you would come up with in analyzing the historical material? How easy and how hard was it to devise this whole conceptual framework, this whole analytical framework? This is just a very general point.
So you're absolutely right. There's this constant back and forth while we were writing the book. The problem of bodies as a place to start was there before we started on it. It's a question that had antedated this project for me and was a motivation for doing it. That it came to be the thing that persisted through the whole book was not obvious at the outset. It was a way in for me, a question that I had, but it became something that, as it turned out from the materials that we were looking at and the questions that we were interested in, became a question that then was part of the arc of the whole book. Once you're interested in that, then you're interested in collisions, because collisions is the place where your account of body gets tested to see if it's adequate, to see, it's not a good account of bodies if you don't have bodies that can survive collisions. And that's exactly a worry that Newton had and Leibniz had. So we already knew about that. We knew collisions were going to be important. Did we know that they were going to take up the whole of the first half of the book? No. That's something that comes out of, and then, comes out of the work that we do. So there were things that we knew that we wanted to look at because we knew that they were important for the figures that we were interested in and for our own concerns, but we didn't know at the outset that they would survive and become central to the way that we framed the whole book. This idea of philosophical mechanics came quite late. Although, you know, with hindsight, we know that we were wrestling with it from very early on. So yeah, it was a long work, a lot of whiteboards, a lot of erasing. Yeah, a lot of thinking that we'd got it, working with it, and then having it not work once it really encountered the reality of what was going on in the sources that we were looking at and the problems that people were trying to solve, and taking seriously what they were trying to achieve. Then yeah, we would, you know, meet the reality of that and have to reframe. So yeah, Marius, do you want to add?
So in terms of the kitchen work of it, every couple of years we would meet at Katherine's place to just like see if there's a synoptic view of the whole as we had it by that point. And she had this giant whiteboard where we would put everything. And when you step back and look at it, all those things on the whiteboard have to hang together in some compelling way. Because if they don't, that means you're not really making sense. You're just saying words trying to hide that, you know, you're not ultimately making sense. And that board got wiped clean and rewritten at least 2 times. So,
more than that.
Yeah, what you get in the book is probably at least the 3rd iteration of like what framework would help us, you know, make sense of all these people and all the papers on this one, you know, problem that we think was up there, you know.
And then all the next level down of structure that went under many more revisions, and then down to the next level of what stays in the chapters. I mean, yeah, I'm heartbroken about how much material I love is not in the book, but it didn't belong in the end, even though I might have spent 6 months working on it. It's just how it is.
Mhm. Mhm.
I don't know, does that answer what you were asking, or was there something more specific you were after?
No, thank you very much. That's wonderful.
We're also hoping that this might be a, you know, inspiration for more people to do, you know, collaborative work, because, you know, hard problems sometimes take more than, you know, one intellect to solve, and, you know, it can be done, as you can see. You know, 2 or even 3 people, if, you know, if they get along well, and if they happen to be interested in this one really difficult problem, you know, you can make it. You can, you know, make it work. I mean, look at us.
I think one has to be very lucky.
True, yeah. And there was a good deal of like good luck that, you know, we had there. So thank you, Katherine. I'm not easy to, as you might, most of you might know this, but I'm not easy to put up with. So Katherine found it in herself to, you know, suffer. Yeah.
I miss my weekly dose of how the world's falling apart, courtesy of Marius. But it's good. It keeps you honest in ways that writing just with yourself, you know, you can trick yourself that you've, you know, that there aren't gaps where there really are. And that's a really wonderful thing, to have somebody equally invested in what you're doing as you, so that you, really, go, I don't understand. It does this from this sentence to this. It doesn't follow. And that's a real gift.
Mhm. Mhm.
And congratulations on succeeding on such a long-lasting and difficult endeavor. And it's all of this is all very inspiring. And well, thank you very much again for this very interesting and profound discussion. So we're very pleased to have you as our guests. And well, perhaps see you in Vienna and Hoppus if you're there, or at our next meeting we will announce soon the other dates of the Open Research Seminar of this year after the summer break. And well, thank you very much again to all of you, and
thank you.
See you
Thank you
soon.
all of you for like making the time to be here, and also to the hosts for organizing it.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you.
It was really great.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, goodbye and see you at Hopos.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye bye.